One of the most recognizable vehicles in Pontiac history is the 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix, and for good reason. The 1969 Grand Prix really took the personal luxury class to a whole new level, and the looks of this vehicle are just amazing, whether the front or the rear. The 1969 Grand Prix was also, just in general, a great car, with 400 or 428 cubic inch engines under hood, J or SJ trims named after Duesenbergs, and a flair all of its own. It was a tremendous styling success, especially given that it succeeded what was effectively a flop in the 1968 Grand Prix, which lasted just a single year. A similarly dramatically styled vehicle to the 1969 Grand Prix was the 1970 and 1971, in particular, Plymouth Barracuda. This particular Barracuda was all new for the 1970 model year and lasted through 1974, and finally eschewed its valiant origins in favor of being based on a new E-body platform that was really an evolution of Chrysler's B-body platform. Well, the 1970 Barracuda is certainly a recognizable vehicle and also dramatically styled. It's a 71 with this multi-port or multi-toothed grin and quad headlights that is especially dramatic and just gave the Barracuda such a great front-end profile on what was a very sporty vehicle. Now, what did the 1969 Grand Prix and 1971 Barracuda have in common, you may ask? One was obviously the product of General Motors, while the other the product of crosstown rival Chrysler Corporation. Well, interestingly, they do share some common DNA. Let's examine that now in a bit more detail. Take a look at this sketch of a particular Pontiac front end, and you'll notice that on the driver's side headlamp cover it says Grand Prix. Now, this bears more than a passing resemblance to the production 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix, and for good reason. This sketch was actually done in Oldsmobile Advanced Studio, where Chuck Jordan commissioned the team of designers to come up with some Pontiac front ends because he wasn't happy with what was coming out of the Pontiac production studio. The result of this exercise was a sketch that you see here for the 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix and performed by a designer in the Oldsmobile Advanced Studio whose name was Don Hood. Clearly, you can see the resemblance in a number of areas on the front end, but notice that Don's original vision for the 69 Grand Prix included hidden headlights, not the exposed headlights that would come to pass for the production 1969 model, perhaps because of cost or simply because of functionality. Nonetheless, the center section of that grille is very close to what made it into production. So how in the world did an Oldsmobile Advanced Studio designer design a front end for a Pontiac? Well, as I mentioned, it came as a result of the competition that was spurred by Chuck Jordan, who was then the executive assistant to GM styling vice president Bill Mitchell. And this was actually a pretty typical technique that was employed at the time in the building to help get the home studio designers some creative juices flowing. Well, allegedly in this case, Chuck Jordan liked the front end so much that he simply took the sketch and then a companion full-size airbrush rendering that Don Hood did for this Pontiac front end and brought in the Pontiac design team to see it, proclaiming, "Gentlemen, here is your front end." You can imagine what the Pontiac designers felt by being brought into an Oldsmobile studio to see a front end that arguably they should have designed in the first place. It probably was not a happy moment for that crew. But nonetheless, it's pretty clear that this sketch and an accompanying full-size airbrush rendering, which has since been lost to history, formed the basis for that 1969 Pontiac front end. Don also made a few other sketches for the front end of the Grand Prix, one of which is seen here. And while this was not the theme that made it through to production, one wonders if there was some inspiration here for the 1970 Pontiac front end, or maybe even the 1971 full-size Pontiac front ends that had that very pronounced beak at the front of them. Or maybe the Pontiac designers themselves came up with that. In any event, what then is the connection between the 69 Grand Prix front end and the 1971 Barracuda front end? Well, the principal connection is that Don Hood transferred from General Motors to Chrysler, where he became a designer there. and is widely credited as having designed the front end of that 1971 Barracuda. Here, in fact, is one of the sketches that Don did for that 1971 Barracuda front end. This sketch is dated September of 1968, and you can see that characteristic multi-tooth grille up front, which was not part of the 1970 redesign, but came in for 1971. Also notice the exaggerated hood scoop. There's certainly a lot of flair in this design, and if you squint a little bit, you can at least see perhaps some of that Pontiac inspiration in this front end by that three-dimensional nature of the grille that comes out into a point. Although the plan view on the frontal area of this Plymouth is obviously very different from the 1969 Grand Prix or the 70 or 71 full-size Pontiacs. Here's another sketch done by Don of the 1971 Plymouth Barracuda front end proposal, and you can see a similarly shaped grille as well as the quad headlights, but this one has a bit more prominent beak to it, where the lettering spelling out CUDA is listed there. Also notice that this vehicle has side exhausts pointing forward, curiously. I don't think that would work in production, but it looks cool in the sketch. And Don is obviously trying to exaggerate the width of the vehicle here somewhat comically. In any event, what's amazing about that pair of sketches is that the front end in the sketches really closely resembles the final production front end, which is super menacing in its overall form and just endows this 1971 Barracuda with a huge amount of character. It looks like there's something powerful underneath the hood, and in some cases there was in these Barracudas, and in other cases there was not. But regardless, the style of the vehicle is unquestionably recognizable and one of the most recognizable front ends of the 1970s for the Chrysler Corporation. In any event, Don was clearly a very talented designer who designed a number of other front ends. He was even nicknamed Mr. Front End by some other designers, and perhaps that was an appropriate name for somebody whose last name was Hood. But regardless, another contribution that Don made to styling history was for the latter 70s Dodge Magnum. And in 1978, when the car was redesigned, he came up with this Cord-inspired front end. And again, Don wanted hidden headlights, which were interestingly placed behind translucent panels on the production version. These translucent panels had to actually move out of the way in order for the headlights to operate. They were not stationary. Regardless, Don was clearly a very talented designer who had success at both General Motors and Chrysler before leaving the automotive industry and starting his own firm. He sadly passed away in 2018 at the age of 84. In any event, hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the 1969 Grand Prix, as well as the 1971 Barracuda front end and their designs. If you did, let me know that you did. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks for watching.